Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're looking at relationships, sex and health education in schools. Can I say, for anybody watching online or anyone in the room, some of the subject matter and things that may be discussed may be unsuitable for children of all ages. And if I can also add, no doubt our panellists will have a range of views. Can I ask that we keep our comments respectful today, please? We've got two panels of witnesses today, all appearing in person. If I can ask our first panel to introduce yourselves, and can you just say whether or not you're happy to be referred to by your first name? And if I can start with you, Tanya.
Yeah, I'm Tanya Carter from Safe Schools Alliance, and I'm perfectly happy for you to call me Tanya.
Thank you.
I'm Lucy Marsh from Family Education Trust, and yes, you can call me Lucy.
I'm Lottie Moore from Policy Exchange, and yes, you can call me Lottie.
Thank you. So, first question from myself, please, and this is to all of you. What should be the objective of relationships and sex education? And does current teaching of RSE fulfil that objective? And Tanya, if I can go to you again first.
Yes, I think the objective should be to give children accurate biological and legal information, because children have a right to know accurate information. They have a right to know what their rights are. And I think we need to be very clear that the most important part of relationships and sex education is that it's part of safeguarding. It's to ensure that children and young people have the information they need to allow them to grow up in the best circumstances possible into healthy and functional members of our society. So I think we need to be very clear that the ultimate aim of this is child safeguarding, and at the moment, no, I do not think that's being fulfilled at all, and I'm very concerned.
Thank you, Lucy.
Yes, I would agree with Tanya's comments that RSE has got to be based on evidence, sound evidence, in terms of teaching children about biology, about the changing bodies, about safe relationships, and also what kind of relationships are going to be healthy and the best for them as they become adults. And no, I don't feel that this is being fulfilled at the moment in either primary school or secondary school.
I agree with both the panellists. I think RSE should be evidence-based, based in fact, and I don't think that that's happening. I think we're confusing facts and beliefs when it comes to teaching children on these issues.
I think ultimately it needs to be about ensuring that any education is for the benefit of the children that it's being delivered to, not because some adults are intent on spreading their worldview. It has to absolutely be for the benefit of children.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in other members of the committee. They will address their questions either to all of you or to some of you. Please just indicate if you want to come in. Mark.
Thanks. Tanya, what do parents and young people need and want, in fact, from RHSE?
Well, I think most of what parents want is they want transparency. They want to work in partnership with schools, and I think that's incredibly important, that all adults in a child's life work together for the benefit of that child, and that's a philosophy that underpins our frameworks in this country. It's the basis of working together to keep children safe. So all adults need to be working together, which means we need total transparency. Schools need to be explaining to parents exactly what they're teaching and why. I mean, it's unfortunate for schools that it's a bit beyond their remit, but if parents are unaware of what children are being exposed to online, schools may have to educate parents as well about the sheer volume of pornography online these days and the type of pornography children are dealing with. I mean, some parents are very well aware, like lots of dads I've spoken to are very concerned and said, this isn't like when we were younger and you were finding a magazine in the hedge and laughing over a pair of boobs with your mates. This is really nasty, violent stuff, which is leading to an epidemic of erectile dysfunction in very young boys, and it's a public health issue. I mean, children I think children want adults to talk to. They want adults to listen to them. They want adults who will help them. But children do seem to be able to tell between safe adults who are enforcing boundaries to help them. And I was always taught on safeguarding training that adults who were trying to be cool and down with the children, that was a risk, that wasn't a safe adult. And indeed, in another one of our legal documents, Keeping Children Safe in Education, that is acknowledged that adults who cannot tell the difference between adults and children are a risk factor. So children want to be listened to, they want adults they can talk to, and they want help and guidance. They want to know that the adults understand what they're being subjected to, because I think the gap is closing a bit now, but certainly when you talk to a lot of young women in their 20s, what they were exposed to online, and they just said the adults around them had no idea and no one tried to help them. And certainly from my own experiences with my daughters, I was aware as far back as 2009, 2010, they were being exposed to really shocking stuff online, places you wouldn't expect it, like in the Facebook feed. And when I was raising this with the school, they were just completely oblivious to how widespread these issues were. So we all need to be open and honest. Parents need transparency, they need help and support. Children need to be listened to, and they need guidance.
On that social media
Yeah.
piece, I think there's been a lot of work done by social media companies and us, for example, here, in trying to address some of that. Do you feel that we are in a different place to where social media was?
No.
2009, are we worse, better?
I think if anything, we're worse. We're dealing. It is so hard these days for parents to monitor online. You're dealing with something like Snapchat, where once it's come through, you'll never see it again. I always trained my daughters, and I've got 4 of them, that if something comes through to you, and if you screenshot on Snapchat, it will send an alert to the person who sent it. So I always trained them, if there was anything you were in any way unsure of, you don't open it until you found one of your sisters and they're there with a phone to take a screenshot if you open something awful. But not everyone is in that situation. I think we've completely dropped the ball on child safeguarding. I don't think we can protect children online at all, and I certainly don't think it's getting any better.
Just to take you back to that transparency, I've got a couple more questions to get through. Just to take you back to transparency, do you, how do you feel that transparency is working? I mean, there are lots of stories about people not being able to get access to materials. Are these, is that a regular occurrence, or is it just isolated incidents?
Well, I don't know. I've certainly had issues getting access to materials for my own children's schools. When I've asked for them and they've instantly been handed over, they've always been very good materials, and I've said thank you very much. But materials that I've really had to fight to get a look at, there have been problems with them, and some things which I've tried to get a look at in my own children's school, I've never managed to have sight on, and my own children have told me they were concerning. Obviously, we hear from lots of parents who cannot get access to materials, but we don't hear from the parents that schools are working well with. So I think really we've established there is a problem. We now need to see how widespread this is, and we don't just need a review, we need a public inquiry into how we got to this stage. I don't know how many people heard the transcript or the testimony from, there was a case went to the ICA.
I don't want to...
Sorry.
If that is the same case, that is...
Sorry, am I saying something I shouldn't now?
yeah.
I will stop.
If it's sub judice, then...
Oh, right, no, sorry about that,
yeah.
sorry.
No, it's fine. I was conscious that I was maybe leading you down a path that I didn't want to...
No.
If it's the same one. Should young people be taught RSE to 18?
I think the question is not should they be taught it, it's what they should be taught. I think obviously it's an important part of safeguarding, but it needs to be done in partnership with parents, and it needs to be for the benefit of children. And yes, up to 18s are children and they will need help and support for all that time.
And lastly, before I move on, young people with SEND, special educational needs or other additional needs, are they receiving RSE delivered in the right way?
Oh gosh, no, I think they're in an even worse situation than other children. I mean, some of the resources we've had sent in to us, some have been just posted on school websites, some have been sent out to parents, some have been used without specialists, and when we've shown them to RSE teachers who we work with, who work with special needs children, they've been really concerned and said, oh, this is far too busy with all the little widgets and it's not getting across what it should be getting across. It could be used very much in the wrong way if it's being used by a non-specialist.
These materials that are designed for kids with additional needs, or just general materials that are...
It's claimed they're designed for kids with additional needs, but people who work with children with additional needs, we've shown them to, are saying that they're not suitable. So it's obviously children with SEN, they have a right to the same education as all other children, but that needs to absolutely be done properly with specialist support. It's not something that can be delivered by a non-specialist.
Yeah, thank you.
And again, safeguarding has got to be at the heart of that, and it's always got to be considered.
Thank you. Lottie, I'm going to come to you next with very, very similar questions. What do young parents and young people want and need from RSHE?
I think we need to get back to basics, really. And what we've seen from our research looking at gender identity teaching is that gender identity is a contested belief system, and schools are teaching this belief system as though it is the fact, is the status quo. And I think that we need to really, really recognise that when we're dealing with these issues, you know, they have implications, and we need to separate the fact from the beliefs, and that needs to be imparted to children in the context of a lesson. Of the schools that responded to our freedom of information requests that we sent out, 72% were teaching that people can have a gender identity that is separate from their biological sex. 25% responded that some children are born in the wrong body. I think that parents should know what's going on, but I also think, you know, it's as important as transparency is for parents to see these. You know, parents are busy, and it's not, you know, parents having to go on site to look at materials. That's not practical for many parents. And we should be able to trust the state to deliver an education that is, as Tanya says, has safeguarding at its core. And I think currently that's not happening.
So what does that mean then? Does that mean publishing materials more widely?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Should young people be taught RSE to 18?
I think, again, I go back to the point is that, you know, whatever we're teaching, it needs to be grounded in evidence. So regardless of what is deemed age appropriate or inappropriate at every age, it should always be about the evidence and based in science.
And what about children with additional needs?
So as part of our research, we discounted the schools that came back to us with special needs schools, just on the basis that some of the issues that we were asking them were not necessarily directly relevant. But of the materials that I have seen, again, I don't think these children are being supported. And we know that, you know, the current cohort of children, for example, that are presenting with gender distress, that, you know, children with additional needs make up a higher proportion, and so therefore I think it is a real issue.
Do you have a figure for that proportion?
I can find one.
Okay.
In
Perhaps
here.
if you've got something that can be forwarded to the committee afterwards.
I can, yeah.
It may even be in the report.
It's in here, but I can get it out.
Super. Lucy, does the current RSE curriculum do enough to help tackle misogyny and violence against women and girls?
No, not at all. we're seeing huge damage being done with children watching porn. I think you have probably seen the recent report by the Children's Commissioner that the average age now for children to start watching porn is 10, and that some children are watching it a lot younger. And we've also got to consider that the amount of children that have access to smartphones. I read a statistic the other day that something like 20% of 4-year-olds have smartphones, and so we're basically giving these children access to be able to look at adult websites from a very young age. And I think that schools are not addressing the fact that the harm that this does to children in being able to form healthy relationships when they're adults. I mean, it's a known fact. The evidence shows that viewing pornography changes the brain, changes the makeup of the brain, and so we're going to end up with a whole generation of young men who are unable to form a healthy relationship with a woman. They'll have erectile dysfunction. There's lots of things that are being seen here. We're seeing increasingly amounts of young boys who are trying to act out pornographic scenes that they've seen. There was one in America the other day with a 6-year-old girl that was assaulted by a group of her peers, and the school actually didn't tell her parents. There was a 13-year-old just gone to court in this country. Again, he'd attacked 3 women trying to act out scenes he'd seen from porn. So until we actually address the fact that children are watching porn, we're never going to solve the problem of violence against women, because children have got access to smartphones, they're going to be able to view it. So I think really we need to be looking at, should children have access to smartphones, and should they be in schools? And for that I would say the answer is no. I don't think smartphones should be in schools.
So there was the Children's Commissioner had highlighted an account of a 12 girl who was strangled during her first kiss. I don't know if you've seen that one, because the 12-year-old boyfriend thought it was normal. What does reviewing access to smartphones, what can schools do to tackle some of this? I mean, my kids have got smartphones. We've got all sorts of controls that they're Apple, so Apple allow family control. I assume it works because I've limited everything, but I don't suppose I really know. What does that?
I know. Well, that's the problem, isn't it? I think probably a lot of kids these days are probably more tech savvy than their parents. So that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, an initial thing. I mean, I know that the government did a U-turn on actually banning smartphones in school. I think that actually we should look at completely banning children having them in school, because that would solve some of the problems of things like children being filmed getting changed, or being filmed in toilets, or upskirting and things like that. That would solve some of it. However, part of the remit of RSE should be actually discussing the harms of viewing pornography. I mean, at the minute it seems to be that quite a few providers are actually saying, well, actually not all porn is harmful, and talking about explicit acts that are more usually seen on porn as if they're normal, and that they're not normal. I mean, I've heard from a GP recently who's been a GP for more than 30 years, and she said over the last couple of years she's had a huge increase in the amount of young women sort of in the late teens, early 20s coming in with injuries from sex, like anal tears, bruises on the neck from strangulation, because they're seeing this as normal. Like you said about the girl that was strangled on her first kiss, these young women are being told that this kind of thing is normal, and they're getting injured because of it. And this is a big problem, and this is something that schools need to be discussing.
I suppose on the flip side of that, if we want to discuss some of these things in RSE, that means we've got to highlight some of these things, haven't we? Does that present a problem?
I think we need to, obviously we can't put this all on parents or all on schools or all on the government. Everyone needs to work together. Yes, at Safe Schools we think smartphones absolutely should not be in schools. Once you've got smartphones in schools, every child in that school is only as protected as the least protected child in that school. It doesn't matter what controls you've got on your own child's smartphone. If another child in that school has no controls on their phone, your child can be exposed to hardcore porn at lunchtime. So yeah, smartphones shouldn't be in schools. I think it's questionable whether we should be allowing children to have smartphones at all. Yes, we need to be educating on this in RSE.
The genie back in the bottle is not going to happen, though, is it?
What?
Stopping children having smartphones now, I think is a very difficult.
Well, it's a conversation we need to have. I mean, we used to let children drink alcohol. We've got laws on that. There's lots of things we have laws on, like we don't allow children to gamble. We've moved the age of consent up to protect children. So it's a conversation we need to have as a society. Certainly, first instance, smartphones should not be in schools. Obviously, we need to be having conversations around porn in schools, but it's what conversations are we having? I mean, we're reviewing some RSE materials at the moment that we're hoping to be able to recommend, and that's more porn critical, looking at the fact that the children who are being exposed to this, they're being exploited. Children are being targeted online by algorithms. Some of the teachers we work with, they have their own TikTok accounts which they've set up so the algorithm thinks that they're a child, so that they can see what sort of things algorithms are targeting children with on TikTok. And she's saying that you're being targeted with porn on TikTok when TikTok thinks you're 15, regardless of whether that's what you were looking at or not. So we need to teach children critical thinking skills, to be savvy online, that they're being targeted and exploited, and that this is not their fault, but they are being exploited by algorithms. And we also need to talk about the exploitation within the porn industry, how the performers are being exploited, how that links with trafficking. And teachers I've spoken to teach that in a whole section on exploitation. So it's not taught as RSE, because porn really has got nothing to do with sex and relationships. It's more to do with exploitation. So she teaches that as she's teaching about other forms of exploitation worldwide, like child labour and child marriage, that type of thing.
Actually, just to jump in on that, that some schools will have sessions for parents on safeguarding. Certainly my own children's school have had times when the parents can come in to discuss how they can protect their children online. And I think part of what schools could do to extend that is to actually have a speaker to come in to speak to them about the dangers of porn. And I went to a conference last year, and there was some research that was done, and when parents were interviewed, 3/4 of them thought that their child had not viewed porn, and when the surveyors asked those same children had they viewed porn, more than half of them had, and the parents were thinking that they hadn't. So that's, I think some parents are probably in denial that the children aren't looking at this. So I think the conversation needs to be had more with parents, really, so that they're aware of what their children are potentially could view or are already viewing. And as Tanya said, it doesn't matter if you said you've got all of the protections on your children's phones, as have I, but do you know what they're looking at when they're with their friends? Do you know what they're looking at when they're at schools? And we don't know that.
Lottie, just finally, is there anything you want to add to the violence against
women? I think so. I think, the current guidance stipulates that at the end of secondary school, pupils should know about equality law and how it works, particularly with regard to the protected characteristics. And as we know from an Ofsted report in 2021, sexual assault by boys to girls at school is a real problem, and girls need to know the sex-based rights accorded to them by the law. And our evidence suggests that is not the case. 30% of schools said to us that if a person self-identifies as either sex, they should be treated as that sex in all circumstances, even if that doesn't match their biological sex. And that's not what equality law says. And so I think that's absolutely relevant to the issue of violence against women and girls.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
I just want you, if you can, to say a bit more about your last statement there. Maybe explain to us how you think it impacts. I mean, you talk about the Equality Act, and you mentioned protection, but I'm not really sure what you meant.
So, in terms of how this links to violence against women and girls, so our report doesn't touch explicitly on violence against women and girls. What we asked schools was how their provision relates to gender distressed children at school, and then also what they're teaching with regards to gender identity. And obviously, the Equality Act is very clear that sex is a protected characteristic, and that if 30% of our schools came back and said that a person who self-identifies as a different gender to their sex should be treated as that in all circumstances. That's not what the law says, particularly with regard to same-sex spaces such as toilets, abuse shelters and various exceptions that the Equality Act stipulates. And I think it's really important within our SHE that girls know that as they go into the world and are, as we know, are exposed to violence.
The law doesn't say it, but equally it doesn't say otherwise. I mean,
Well,
we know
there
that...
there
we
are
know,
exceptions.
Excuse me. We know that each generation has more and more people identifying as LGBTQ+. And young people are coming out at an early age. Is that not a natural and positive consequence of society becoming more accepting of the LGBTQ+ community?
I would say this is a very, very complex issue, and that children gender-distressed children at schools that come out at school or, wish to change gender, it is not for schools to be making the decisions as to whether that's the right course of action for those children.
They're not be supporting them.
Of course they should be supported. I don't think anyone would say that they shouldn't be supported. But ultimately there's a safeguarding blind spot when it comes to gender-distressed children at school, and that's what we need to address, that this is a safeguarding issue, and it's not being treated as one.
Okay. Can I just pick up something that you said earlier, Lottie? You said gender belief. What do you mean by gender belief?
So gender identity is a contested belief system. It's in the same way that there are other beliefs. It's not based on evidence. It's not based in fact. And that's what I mean when I say a belief.
Thanks, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. I just wanted to pick you up on your survey, Lottie, because you said that you'd surveyed schools and that 30% had usually come out. So I just wanted to know how big was the sample of schools that you actually surveyed?
Yeah, so we sent freedom of information requests to over 300 maintained secondary schools, representative local authority, and of that 300, 154 responded to either all or part of the questions that we asked.
Colin.
Thank you, Chair. Tanya and Lucy, what would you define as being appropriate content for RSE?
I think it depends on whether you're talking about primary or secondary, because obviously they're different for both. Well, I think that we need to get back to, as Lottie said, we need to get back to basics. We need to get back, certainly in primary school, we need to get back to the basics of what happens to children's bodies and the differences in different sex bodies, what happens to boys, what happens to girls. And girls need to know about periods and how the body will change. And I think both boys and girls need to know that puberty is a very awkward and difficult age for most people who go through it. And I don't think many would look back on puberty and think, oh, that was a really fun time. So I think they need to know the basics and the biology about how their bodies are going to change. I think we need to go back to what they need to know under the law. They need to know about pregnancy, and they need to know very much about safeguarding and how to protect themselves.
Yes, like I said at the beginning, they need biologically and legally accurate information, which means, yes, primary school children need to know about puberty and the changes coming to their body, ideally before that happens. They need accurate information about reproduction, about how you get pregnant. Well, once you get up to secondary school, you're learning about how you get pregnant, how you don't get pregnant, how you protect yourself from disease. They need to know what the laws are around sexual assault, what is rape, and that we have laws against that in this country. And I would just like to say at this point that in the Equality Act we do have exceptions that allow for single-sex spaces for both adult women and in schools. So the law does give provision for single-sex spaces.
So do you think that children should be taught about pornography and the dangers of watching pornography? Do you think that children should learn that you can get sexually transmitted diseases from having intercourse?
Yes,
do you believe that children should learn that there are different types of sexual activity between two women or between two men? Or, do you believe that the children should be prepared for something which is inevitable when they leave school?
Absolutely. We want children to have education that's benefits for them, but some of the materials we've seen, it's really not beneficial to children. It's really not beneficial to children to be told that they may find participating in hardcore porn acts liberating. That's not beneficial to children in the slightest. And we really need to question the motivations of the person who wrote those materials.
Yeah. But isn't there sort of a central base where the information that schools are giving out, isn't that not checked?
No, it's not checked at all. This is the whole point. It's a complete Wild West. There is no quality control.
Schools don't actually give lessons on oral sex, for example. They don't give lessons on choking in relationships.
I think oral sex is covered in relationships and sex education, and I think you're asking questions here, not taking on board the fact that what we're raising here are very serious safeguarding concerns with what some children have been exposed to in their RSE. Like the issues being raised are that when these outside providers have come into school, that there was absolutely no regulation of, no scrutiny of. When children have then looked them up online afterwards because they have further questions, so they think that's when they can get answers, then they have been subjected to really inappropriate content because some of these individuals also run their own sex toys companies, which, while butt plugs are absolutely fine for adults, they are not something you want your 11-year-old finding when they look up who came to teach them RSE.
So at what age would you say that teaching somebody that oral sex can cause sexually transmitted diseases, at what age should we be warning children of the potential?
That's a secondary school thing, isn't it? Of course we should be explaining...
Do you think that they should learn that oral sex can in some cases cause sexually transmitted disease at a later time, when they're older?
Of course we do.
When it's developmentally appropriate, but the problem is that what's developmentally appropriate for, say, one 15-year-old may not be for another 15-year-old. So this is why we need to bring it back to the parents. I mean, the parents are the primary educators of the children, so they need to be able to approve and know whether that they know their children better than any teacher. So they need to be able to have the information of whether they feel that's appropriate for their child.
So do you believe that there are risks by not giving children information about the dangers of sexually transmitted disease, of looking at pornography? So if we're going to deny them a structured lesson, an approved lesson, if we're going to give them information which is to safeguard them in future life, isn't it important that we give them that information?
I think we're talking at cross purposes here. What you're describing is what I consider to be appropriate education. The concerns I'm raising is that this is not what some of the RSE going into school is these days. What you're describing is what I would expect to be going into schools. That is not what's going into schools. Of course, children should be told what the age of consent is, and that after the age of consent, if they engage in oral sex, yes, there's a risk of STI, but we're talking about providers who are graphically describing online to 14-year-olds how to deep throat.
And that is fact. Do you have factual information?
Yes, we do.
And where does that come from, that information?
That came from BISH. It was on their website.
From?
BISH, an organisation called BISH.
Yeah.
We have loads
and that's used in schools?
They are directed to it in schools. This is one of the main...
Are they taught it in schools? Is that school actually delivering what BISH are offering?
I don't think you're understanding the safeguarding implications of schools directing children to sites where they are told this.
No more questions for now, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kim.
Thanks. You've all talked about getting back to basics, but, we have to understand we're not in the 1950s. We are in the 21st century, where young people have access to a wider range of information than any time in history. So, do you not believe that the classroom is the best place to discuss issues around sex and relationships? So Lottie, question for you is, what qualifications, training or expertise should teachers and external providers have to deliver RSE?
So firstly, I think there needs to be, as with every adult that interacts with children at school, there needs to be a real awareness of what safeguarding principles are. There needs to be an understanding of the obligations for schools to be politically impartial, and that when they're teaching about different belief systems, that they are given a balanced view.
And I just pick it up on that politically impartial, because all schools have to operate to those standards under legislation, so that already exists. So I just want
the legislation already exists,
yeah.
It's whether the legislation is being adhered to when it comes to these external agencies, which in many circumstances it's not.
I wasn't talking about external agencies, I was talking specifically about qualification and training that's needed for teachers in schools to deliver, because we all know that teachers at the moment are overstretched. We know that the government has provided some funding for RSE, but it's not enough. We know that schools are under pressure, in terms of the national curriculum, the best of times. So what should be available in schools to enable teachers to deliver RSE in a way that meets the needs of all children at all age groups?
Absolutely, and I completely share the concern with how difficult this situation is for teachers. I mean, I've spoken to teachers who are, tearing their hair out about the current status and what's expected of them. I completely, I welcome that, but I think what we really need to focus on here is that with the guidance and with the review, it needs to be timely, it needs to be robust, and it needs to be really, really clear as to what the boundaries that need to be set as to what teachers should and shouldn't be saying when it comes to RSHE.
So while schools, do you think, use an external providers to deliver RSE at the moment?
I think, as you say, I think teachers are overstretched, and it seems like it's a place to go to get the to help. I think that's certainly there. I think these external agencies are also have been incredibly influential in operating under different guises, such as really noble guises such as equality and anti-bullying. I think that's great. I think they've come into schools often under those guises and then end up actually with a slightly different agenda. And I think that's gone under the radar.
And do you know whether the Oak Academy deliver any type of RSE at all? And if so, how would you rate it?
I can't speak to the Oak Academy. That's not one of the schools that was in my that we sent freedom.
Well, it's an online platform.
It's the ones that are bringing in. They've been instructed by the DfE to bring in more evidence-based materials.
And sorry, I can't speak to that.
And again, going back to external providers, because you've mentioned that schools procure an awful lot of services to deliver a range of different things. So how do you think that schools should judge external providers who are delivering RSE?
Again, I think it's a really good question. I think there needs to be a focus, as we say, and schools need to have full access to the materials that the external agencies are providing, and those external agencies need to understand that parents also need to have full access to those materials. So any kind of intellectual property rights or confidentiality in terms of not being able to provide those materials, those agencies will just have to accept that unfortunately they can't be used in school.
And are you saying that most schools are not providing information to parents in terms of the resources that are used to deliver RSE in schools?
I think,
or is it just a drop in the ocean? And do you have an evidence base to support that?
So, in terms of my research, when I asked for RSHE materials, and I appreciate I wasn't asking as a parent, but when I asked for RSHE materials, several schools came back to me and said that they couldn't give them to me because of the commercial obligations that they had to their provider. And I know, and I'm sure the other panellists can speak to this, that there have been instances where parents have been refused access. And all parents have been told that they have to go onto site to see the materials, which obviously as busy parents, that's just not always feasible.
They're all my questions. Thanks, Lottie. Thanks, Chair.
Can I just ask Lucy and Lottie, because you've both made the same point around parents being given the opportunity to see the materials. Do you think that's realistic, given the challenges around resource, etc.? Because it doesn't happen in any other area of education, does it?
Well, if these materials were published on the school's website, then the parents would be able to view them.
Are they published in every subject?
No, but there isn't as contested as this in terms of you're not going into your geography lesson and being worried that your child might be taught about strangulation and anal sex. So that isn't the question, is it? This is a really, really important area of safeguarding, and parents want to know and have a right to know if their children are being kept safe in school.
Yeah, I think there's a massive difference between teaching maths and teaching about sex. And we need to go back to safeguarding and safer recruitment. Safer recruitment was introduced to scrutinise the motivations of anybody wanting access to children, because sadly we know anywhere there are children or vulnerable people, it will attract predators. And this is why we're asking for a public inquiry, because we're not sure people are understanding the seriousness that this is a very serious medical safeguarding and lobbying scandal that has unfolded under the Conservative government. And as far as I can see, the opposition, rather than challenging the government for their severe failures, are challenging the whistleblowers who are trying to draw attention to that. I mean, can I ask if the panel have all read our report into WHO and UNESCO, which I asked to be circulated?
Well, we're not here to answer questions, we're here to ask questions.
Right, no, that's fair enough. But we have produced that report, which is on our website, and that has forensically taken apart how shaky the foundations of what we're currently teaching children are. So we want a public inquiry, because this is a national safeguarding failure, and we need to get this right for children. Of course children should receive this education in school, but what we are saying is that the education they're receiving in school has been infiltrated. A lot of the motivations behind it and a lot of the materials need to be scrutinised, and this needs to be done transparently, independently, and people need to be asking questions about this rather than silencing whistleblowers, which has happened in every previous safeguarding scandal we have seen.
As you know, there's an RSHE review.
Yeah, and I want a public inquiry.
And I'll move on to questions. We'll move on to questions around that.
If we actually go back to what you were saying about the transparency, so back in 2014, when the government were consulting on making RSE compulsory, one of our trustees gave evidence to the Education Select Committee about what was going on back then, and then in the report that was written by Nicky Morgan in 2015. One of the Education Select Committee's recommendations was that schools do publish the curriculum for RHSE on their website, and the Education Secretary had responded saying that the DFE was going to actually look into this to make sure schools were complying with it. So evidently we're now at the stage where this hasn't happened. We've got to the stage where we're contacted frequently, and I know Tanya is, by parents saying that they can't see what the children are being taught and asking us whether we have examples of what's being taught by these external providers. So clearly the transparency hasn't happened.
Okay, thank you. Do you think RSHE should be compulsory in schools?
I think that parents should be able to have the right to fully withdraw their child if they want to, because I feel should be the parents' choice of what they want their children to be taught, and I think we should restore the right for them to be able to withdraw their children if they feel that that's the right thing to do.
What about the children's right?
The children, very young children,
do they not have a right to be educated in the same way as all their peers?
If the parents are the primary educators of their children, and parents are the ones who should have their say over their children. If we're going into sort of child-led education, that's a whole nother conversation.
The focus be on the child and not the parent.
The focus should be on the family unit, and part of the
not
problem.
the child's education and getting them ready for life.
Yeah, but if the parent is not agreeing with what's being taught, and they have a problem with safeguarding, and they're very worried that what their child's being taught is inappropriate, then yes, the parent should have a say.
If I can stay with you, Lucy, how do you think the RSHE review should be conducted?
I feel that we're past the point of the Department for Education being able to do this review, because the actions of the DFE are the reason why we've got to this stage in the first place, and I agree with Tanya that it's at the point where we need a fully independent inquiry.
Do you have anyone in mind?
No, but I can keep you posted on that if anybody springs to mind.
Just wondering how you ensure independence.
Well, I mean,
think the DFE would argue that they're independent.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, I would want it to operate in the manner of the CAS review, that we have a fully independent person coming in to look at all of the evidence.
So, taking your view, what you've just said, in mind, what steps do you think the government need to take to satisfy stakeholders that the review is impartial and for the outcome to be accepted?
I feel the steps needed to be taken now, because we're so concerned, and the alarm has been raised so many times now. We've had Miriam Cates's report, we've had Lottie's report. We are, as an organisation, getting a lot of contact from parents who are really seriously worried about what's going on. Tanya will say the same thing in terms of what they're doing. I feel that we need to pause RSE pending an independent inquiry, because there is no safeguarding going on, because at the moment, as Amanda Spielman from Ofsted has said, there is a Wild West situation at the moment, because anybody can set themselves up as an expert in RSE. There's no legislation, there's no oversight. Ofsted have said that they're not looking at these materials. I think we need to press pause on that, pending an independent inquiry, and I feel that the government need to make sure that they get somebody completely neutral with the required expertise to oversee this.
Yeah, can I just ask you, I'm interested in this in this inquiry that you talk about, and you may have known quite recently Baroness Casey has done a review into the Met Police. What if you were to get this review and it was somebody like Baroness Casey and she was going to report back and said what is existing is fine and there's no problem with it? How would you feel then?
I would worry that she hadn't been on a safeguarding course if she thought that what was existing in schools now was appropriate.
But someone like Baroness Casey's got a reputation for doing independent review. So, I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate
We need someone with a really thorough understanding of child protection and safeguarding.
And you've got that person, and they're doing a review, and they come back and say the current situation is, as far as they're concerned, there is no problem with it. How would you then, as campaigners, feel?
Well, with no one with a thorough understanding of child protection and safeguarding,
what if they
is going
did?
to... Well,
we'd present the evidence and say, look at the evidence.
It doesn't really matter how independent. If it doesn't say what you want it to say, you're not going to be satisfied.
Anybody who fully understands child protection and safeguarding will pull concerns out of this.
And I've said if that person is appointed, and you've all agreed that person is independent, and they do it, I'm purely playing devil's advocate here, okay? Because we've seen public inquiries and they've come back and they haven't gone the way that one side wants to the argument. So they do the review, they come back and they say what the current system is as we consider it to be appropriate. How would you then feel? Would you then accept that the system...
No, we keep going back to the evidence. Any policy's got to be based... Okay, policy decision's got to be based on evidence.
Yeah, that's fine. I've got no more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a risk that in reviewing the teachings of RSE and gender issues in particular, that we're repeating the failings of Section 28? Because my campaign in life started, I'm going to give my age away, around the 80s, pushing back on Section 28 and the damage that it done. And to me, it feels like we're just going backwards a little bit. So, do you think there's a risk there?
What people have said to me, which I find really sad, is I've had lesbians say to me that they think that young lesbians in schools today are now in a worse situation than they were when they went to their convent school and nothing was mentioned to it at all. I mean, my daughter, for example, her and her girlfriend were out when they were at secondary school from year 10 onwards, and initially there were some issues there, and I supported them with that, and I spoke to the school and it was all dealt with and they were able to be out. When they went up to the sixth form that had this Pride Club and was completely stonewalled and was teaching basically lies about the Equality Act. They were then back in the closet because of the things the other children were saying, because they were reacting so badly to how it was being mishandled in the sixth form. And gay men I've spoken to have said that the fact that young boys who were like them as children, who enjoyed dressing up, they liked pink, or some gay men weren't like that. They were just sort of like any other boy, but they were gay. They are very concerned that what we're looking at with all these transitioning children at the moment is in fact medical conversion therapy of children who would otherwise grow up to be gay and lesbian. So I'm incredibly concerned about what children who would grow up to be gay and lesbian are exposed to these days, not only online but in schools. And schools should be challenging the misinformation that children are subjected to online when they're reading online that discovering a same-sex attraction may mean they're really the opposite sex. Schools should be challenging this misinformation, not reinforcing it.
Teaching young people about LGBT people doesn't make the LGBT community not exist, does it? Surely it opens that conversation.
Well,
no, I'm just putting that to you.
You're saying something I haven't said. I want... My children have always known gay people exist. Some of their mates at schools had two mums. Like I've said, my daughter's out, she's lesbian. I want these conversations to happen, but I want open and honest conversations about what same-sex attraction is, and that it certainly doesn't mean that you've been born in the wrong body, or that you might be the opposite sex, or that you might want to be put on a pathway to a lifetime of medication, unnecessary surgery and body hatred.
Do you believe that trans people exist?
What do you mean by trans people?
I think you know what a trans person is.
I'm asking you to tell me what you think a trans person is.
No, I'm asking you if you believe that trans people exist. Do you think that there are people that believe that they're born in the wrong body?
There are people who believe they are born in the wrong body, yes, but that's certainly not something we should teach small children, that they may be in the wrong body. How's that helping them with self-acceptance or to grow up and be healthy?
And if they do grow up thinking that, is it not better that they've had that conversation and understand the issues around it?
Well, where
to go if they need to talk about it?
Well, where can they go that will support them?
Acceptance?
Where can they go that will support them with watchful waiting rather than instantly going to affirmation? We'd like children supported in school in line with what's coming out of the Cass review. We certainly don't want children lied to that they've been born in the wrong body. I mean, the research tells us that children left alone, just supported, allowed to pursue their own interests, dress how they like, be friends with who they want to, not sort of put in boxes for the stereotypes for the sex. Most of those children, they grow up and they become lesbian and gay adults. And the way we're treating them at the moment, we are robbing some of these children of the opportunity to grow up healthy, and we're robbing them of sexual function even. I mean, the stories coming out from detransitioners, how many detransitioners have you spoken to? Because it's heartbreaking speaking to them.
Carolyn?
Fine.
Okay. Can I thank you all for coming and giving your evidence today?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I thank you all for coming here today? If I can start off by asking you to introduce yourselves and to say how you would like to be addressed, please. If I start with Dr. Sophie King-Hill.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sophie King-Hill, and please call me Sophie.
Okay.
I'm Jonathan Bagley. I'm Chief Executive of the PSHE Association, which is the National Subject Association for Personal Social Health and Economic Education, which is quite a mouthful, a wonderful thing. Just for context, that's the school subject through which the RSHE statutory requirements tend to be delivered in schools.
Thank you.
And I'm very happy for you to call me Jonathan.
Thank you.
Hello, Lucy Emerson, Chief Executive of the Sex Education Forum. Would you like me to flip this round? Has it got the correct information showing?
No, we can see
Yeah,
both sides.
fine.
Thank you. Well, we can see one side. Okay, thank you. Can I start off by asking you what should be, this is to all of you, what should be the objective of relationship and sex education, and does current teaching of RSE fulfil that objective? And I'm going to start with Sophie, if I can.
I think in terms of the current teaching of relationships and sex education, it should be so that young people can go on to live a happy and healthy life, however they want to live that life, and that's really vitally important. The evidence suggests and tells us robust, valid evidence tells us that young people want to be involved in the design of relationships and sex education. They need to be a part of that so that we know what we're building on. The same as parents as well. Parents want to be involved. They want schools to be able to educate our young people together and to play a really valuable role in that. And it's really vital to the outcomes of children and young people that that's built from the outset, that that's delivered in a very pedagogical way, that's very sensible, that's appropriate to the needs of the young people that you're talking to, and that it's incremental and that it's built very sensibly within the context into which they're situated, which is something that is vitally important in relationships and sex education.
Thank you. Can
I think the clear objective for RSHE is to ensure that children can thrive in a fast-changing world, to ensure that they can be safe, happy and healthy. And I think it's worth reiterating the consensus around this. I mean, we led efforts to build the case for statutory PSHE, which was a case supported by over 100 organisations, over 5 education unions, 5 select committees, 6 Royal Medical Colleges, broad range of experts, and particularly around safeguarding, because of course I absolutely agree with the previous panel that safeguarding is absolutely fundamental here, and the role of RSHE in supporting safeguarding was very much recognised and supported by the National Police Lead for Child Protection, the Association of Independent Local Safeguarding Children Boards, the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners, because we know that teaching young people about healthy relationships, about what good relationships look like, helps them recognise unhealthy relationships and also gives them confidence to speak out and seek support should they encounter issues. And the evidence around that, the social science evidence, is extremely clear as well. But I think we should also say that of course it's vital for safeguarding, but we want so much more for our children than simply being safe. We also want them to be healthy, we want them to thrive, and the evidence around the role of RSHE in supporting physical health, around influencing diet and lifestyle choices in terms of reducing substance use, and of course its role in positively supporting mental health and emotional well-being and reducing issues which can negatively affect mental health, like bullying, is also really clear. And finally, if you do all of that right, you create a virtuous circle where it also supports academic attainment. And again, the evidence that you do this well, because of course in 2 ways. One, it is removing barriers to learning because children are thriving in their environments and they have agency and they're prepared for life. But it also develops the social and emotional skills they need to thrive academically as well. So in sum, RSHE is absolutely vital for safeguarding. It is also about enabling all children to thrive.
Thank you. And Lucy?
Thank you. The objectives of relationships, sex and health education are about contributing to healthy, happy, safe children, young people and future adults. The safety aspect of that is about protecting and preventing, for example, knowing to be able to recognise something that's abusive, to know that if something happens that is abusive or harmful, that you have a right as a child to ask for help, to get help, to know those rights. In terms of health, that's about mental health. It's also about physical health. So that would be, we know from the research evidence that that contributes to a delay in sexual debut. That means starting to have sex later, not earlier. The research is conclusive about that. And increased use of contraception, reduced unplanned teenage pregnancy. So there's that aspect of the physical health. In terms of mental health and relationship experiences, we know that RSE contributes to reduced relationship violence, and there's a lot of evidence that's built up on that in recent years. So the Healthy, Happy, Safe trio, which in 2019 the RSHE guidance came in with those words, are very much the objectives. They're shared objectives, societal objectives, very much shared by parents. The majority of parents were incredibly supportive about the introduction of this as a school subject. They're also the objectives that we hear from children and from teachers as well.
Thank you. Mark?
Thanks, Chair. I'll be asking very similar questions to those I asked to the first panel. Sophie, what do parents and young people want and need from RHSE?
It's really vital that the RSHE that's given is contextualised in terms of the school and the young people and the local community and the religiosity and the ethnicity, and all of these complex factors are taken into account when looking at what parents want and especially what children and young people want. There's something really key about that I noticed as an academic. So I've been working in this field for 20 years. So I'm an academic now, but prior to that I was working teaching relationships and sex education to young people, and I've worked with some really diverse and fantastic groups such as teenage parents and those that are ex-offenders. And time again, and I saw this in the Cates dossier, the Sexuality in Education document that's just come out, the Falling Asleep at the Wheel document. Where are the voices of young people in all of this? And it's taught me over the last 20 years of my career, we really do need to be listening, because they are the experts in what they need. And it's as if we're talking over the tops of their heads at the moment. We need a stakeholder group of young people to be involved in this. They live in a completely different world to the one that we live in now. You know, I'm 43 now. It might as well be an alien planet, you know, where children and young people are situated, and we need to get them on board. And from my experience and the research that I've done, some recent research that just came out with the NSPCC, and a big plethora of research, academic, rigorous, trustworthy, reliable research is out there to say we need to engage with young people. They're not passive in this. They're not receptacles that we just kind of fill with information. We have to work with them in terms of seeing where they're at. And time again, I see in my research is young people telling us, you know, you're telling us things, you're teaching us things we already know. You're telling us things we know. You're telling us things about what we've seen online. But what they do say, which is really crucial, is that they want to get their relationships, health and sex education from a school setting, from a trusted adult, in a trusted environment. And I agree that there is a real safeguarding risk. You know, having done this for 20 years, when I read the Cates dossier, my heart sank. That I have never been in my 20-year career as concerned as I am now about the fact that evidence, or something that is, as an academic, we're very rigorous about evidence, and something that had a very shaky evidence base at the very least was presented in Parliament and has led to the discussions we're having today, which I think are useful. We have to have these discussions. But for me, you know, the evidence in there is very misleading, it's very emotive, it's very scaremongering, but there are no voices of the young people, and this is crucial. You know, in terms of, if we think of pedagogical, the way that we teach and learn with children and young people, so a pedagogical position, that's not mentioned in there. You know, there's sensationalism in terms of...
So those sensationalist bits, are you saying that they don't exist?
I'm saying I would like to see them and how they work in the pedagogical environment within the context that they're in, but because it's so poorly written, it's very hard for me as an academic to make an accurate judgment on that. But if somebody wanted to give me the evidence...
There is a context in which we should be teaching children about
sex, absolutely,
for example.
Yeah, we really need to be looking at the context that they're in. So, and so putting parameters on relationships and sex education for me is incredibly dangerous. I cannot emphasise this to the committee enough. We cannot put age parameters on what we are teaching our children. You know, for instance, what if somebody's sharing extreme pornography at 11 and all their classmates saw, but the parameter says you can't teach it till they're 13? What happens to the educator in that position? They're bound to a policy, but also they need to safeguard the child.
Just to go back to asking children what they want. If I ask a group of children what they want, it won't necessarily tell me what those children need. So how does that...
I would probably respectfully disagree with some of that statement. So in terms of talking to young people, in terms of working with them, in my experience, and not just my anecdotal experience in research that myself and colleagues from academia and professional settings have carried out, young people want to talk, they want to engage, they want to help, they want to be a part of this. This is a huge part of their life now that they really want to negotiate. But we can bring our professional experience into that, but that's with them in a co-design, participatory way, that we're working with them for the best interests of them. And as I said, this is not anecdotal. There is a wealth of research out there, and not from people like me as a social scientist, but from social policy. We've got our educationalists, we've got criminologists, we've got psychologists, we've got mathematicians, and we've got our professional colleagues from PHSE Association, Sex Education Forum, Brook Charity. There are people that have been in this field for a very long time that are looking at this through very different professional lenses, all saying the same thing, and it's so vitally important that we get this right for young people.
At the very start, you talked about context, religiosity, and various others. How does that fit with, for example, contraception and abortion in Catholic or Islamic schools?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not coming here saying it's really simple. There's a complexity to it, and sometimes there's a real kind of wicked problem around it. But the best thing to do is communication, is to involve our stakeholders, which would be the schools, which would be the parents, the carers, the young people, and talk to them and really kind of negotiate the context into which we're situated in the moment. Transparency is key. It really is key with this. But also it's being realistic.
Transparency we heard before, does that mean schools being transparent with materials as well?
Yeah, from my position as an academic, I completely see why schools would want to invite people in to look at resources, because you need that pedagogical lens on it, rather than looking at something that you pick up and read without the context being given. But as an academic, we're all about transparency.
Okay. Lucy, sorry, I'll maybe just push on children with additional needs.
Yeah, I think before we even begin this discussion, we have to acknowledge and fully accept that every child and young person has a right to have a happy and healthy relationship throughout their lives. So young people with additional needs have a right to good relationship, sex and health education as everybody else. And there is a complexity to this, but there is a complexity to special educational needs. It's not. You could have someone with very, very profound needs and somebody who hasn't got such profound needs. And this is where, again, age parameters would be very dangerous, and the context and the building on what they know already, and to working with them, to thinking about how they can have really happy, valuable lives where they go on to flourish. Is important, vitally important. And this is where I would say we need to bring in special educational needs experts, special educational needs teachers, and be steered by them and take their advice and see where they're positioned with it. This shouldn't be compartmentalised, that we need the different perspectives from lots of different professional positions and careers and experience, but it has to be robust. It has to be evidence-based, it has to be valid, it has to be reliable.
Thank you.
Before you ask a next question, can I just bring Carolyn in, because I think it's
Dr. King-Hill, can I just take you to something you just said? You talked about transparency, but surely that is what the parents are asking for, is transparency in what their children are actually being taught.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We have to get on board our key stakeholders. I mean, parents are notoriously difficult to engage anyway, but, get the key stakeholders on board. Get a steering group of parents together, get a steering group of young people together, a steering group of teachers together, school leadership teams work together, and that's one of the key aspects of it.
But you can understand the protectionism as a parent, that you'd want to protect your child from inappropriate.
Yeah, but I suppose it goes back to how do you define what inappropriate means?
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's inappropriate. I'm just saying you can understand.
Oh, yeah, I completely understand it. And this comes from, from years and years and years of a convergence of lots of different factors, why people are so embarrassed, worried, concerned when somebody brings up sex, and especially with sex and young people, because the two are mutually exclusive within the culture that we live in today. So, this isn't a blame game. This isn't saying, parents who think this is bad are bad. That's the position they're in, because this is where societally this has led them to this point, and it needs unpacking and unpicking with them.
Thank you.
So can I just ask you, before I bring Mark back in, do you share the view that the content, the materials, etc., should be shared with the parents?
Yeah, I can't see anything wrong with that as long as it's contextualised correctly within how it's taught with the experts in the classroom in a pedagogical way. You know, it's very difficult if you're teaching somebody about oral sex to just pick up a lesson plan and read that. If you work as an accountant and you generally don't talk about sex as a rule of thumb, but if you go into a school, have a meeting with the people that are teaching that, and they say, this is why, here's the social context, this is why we're doing this, here's our aims, here's our objectives, this is the benefits to the children and young people, you know, to learning about this to keep themselves safe.
I think one of the previous panellists made reference to educating parents. Do you think that needs to happen to some degree?
Yeah, and again, there's nothing wrong with education. It's from one point of learning to the next, isn't it, in terms of working with parents and carers. And I think what could be... I can't see any huge issues with getting parents on board and educating them and demonstrating to them through very valid, robust evidence. And I can't emphasise that enough. You know, the evidence has to be robust, has to be reliable. And talk to them about it and give them that kind of context that we're in, that actually we all want to keep children safe. And I mean, in terms of safeguarding, it's a really big issue in terms of how we work with children that might be abused. So I was the lead for one half of the National Sibling Sexual Abuse Project that was government funded through the Home Office. And we saw that sibling sexual abuse is one of the most common familial types of abuse that's happening. However, because it's situated within a dysfunctional family unit a lot of the time, young people tend not to disclose until they're a lot older. But if we were giving them really robust, really clear, transparent information, young children and young people from when they were younger, then they can recognise when harm is being done to them and speak up sooner. So there's a huge safeguarding issue here if we are going to start rolling back.
Thank you. Jonathan, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, you know, high quality PSHE has always been a partnership between schools and parents, and the question of transparency is absolutely critical. Of course, schools should be helping parents understand the resources that are being used and you know, making those available. I mean, we've always recommended, as Dr. King-Hill said, you know, bringing parents in not to make it inconvenient, but to enable that conversation about, because this isn't only about content. It's one thing to have the content of the lessons, it's also about how this is being taught. It's about education. It's about what does it actually look like in the classroom? How are discussions being managed? What are your policies around the sorts of ways you'll handle questions? So ensuring that parents feel really confident in that. We also recognise, of course, it's not always convenient for parents to come in. We provide parents copies of our materials to be shared and see no issue with that. But I think there's a conversation we're not having, which beyond simply providing parents with a huge number of lesson plans, how are we supporting them to engage in their child's RSHE curriculum? How are we supporting that relationship between schools and parents? Because this is an opportunity for schools and parents to support their children in a structured, developmental and progressive way so that they can actually have those conversations, and schools can say, well, actually, you know, next term we are going to be talking about consent. Here's some materials about it. Here's some things. So kind of that parental education piece. But we know that when parents are given a really clear sense not only of the materials being used but the rationale for it and how these conversations are safely managed in the classroom, that almost unfailingly they are absolutely supportive of what schools are doing. So I think that relationship is really critical, but it goes far beyond simply making lesson plans available.
Thank you. Mark?
Thanks, Chair. Lucy, I'm going to take you back to the original question that I asked. What do parents and young people want and need from RSE?
There are different dimensions of that. One of them is the content or the topics, and the RSHE guidance maps out quite a comprehensive range of topics which broadly children and young people and parents support. So those are things like knowing about privacy and boundaries, appropriate and inappropriate behaviour, knowing about body changes, so the classic puberty education, which is something that obviously impacts on everybody, about families as well, about respect for diversity, about healthy, unhealthy relationships and an LGBT inclusive approach to that, about power imbalances, more nuanced work around consent. A lot of young people have told us through a survey of 1,000 young people which we commissioned independently that they're learning quite well about understanding sexual consent, but the sort of more nuanced aspects like power imbalances in relationships are not being touched as much. Also pornography being one of the most neglected topics, which brings me on to the gap in teacher training, which is something I'll perhaps be able to talk about later. So the content is broad, comprehensive, which is there in the guidance, but there is a gap between what is mapped out and what parents and children and young people might be expecting to get and what is actually happening. There's a lot of variability that our survey showed up. So topics like healthy relationships that we might assume are happening in all secondary schools across the country, unfortunately 16 and 17-year-olds were reporting in around 50% of cases that wasn't covered or wasn't covered adequately by the time they'd left secondary school. So we're not yet covering what's listed, so we've got to be really mindful of that. Aside from content, how RSE is taught is absolutely fundamental. Young people are saying they want more open discussions. They want proper lesson time, that a lot of these topics are being squeezed into perhaps tutor time or entirely neglected from their education. They want factual information, but they also want to explore attitudes and values, to develop skills around communication. They want to address things like cultural and faith perspectives. It takes time. They want competent teachers who've had the right training. They want to see a timetable where there is space to do this work. And when talking to parents as well, we find parents are supportive of the content but sometimes confused about aspects of it. They do want to have some of those misunderstandings unpacked. So an acronym like LGBT, we've heard about schools who said, well, parents came asking, what is this LGBT thing my children are learning? And they didn't know what LGBT stood for. Once that was explained, and how it would be approached in the classroom, and this was in a primary school, the parents said, oh, is that all it is? That's fine. So we do take a lot for granted about people's understanding of the content and how it might be taught, because a lot of parents haven't had the experience of a good sex education. So these sort of pedagogical aspects about what an open discussion looks like need to be explained, but also they rest on the trained teachers, and both parents and children deserve trained, competent teachers to be able to provide this content.
And children with additional needs, are they getting what they need?
I'd just like to stress in terms of children with additional needs that they are more likely to have been sexually and physically abused compared to the wider population, and they are less likely to receive relationships and sex education. So we really need to prioritise meeting their needs. When we train, so Sex Education Forum provides quite a lot of training for special schools, and teachers are very grateful for that because they often say, this is the first training I've had, there isn't very much specialist training available. The spectrum of additional needs is so wide that every individual learner needs to be understood and catered for. We have to support schools in understanding the kind of resources to choose, the kind of language to choose, because any ambiguity around sex in this context is very, very risky, and yet as a society we rely on a lot of ambiguity for talking about sex and relationships. There is certainly a long way to go, but I would also say that special schools tend to be very proactive about their provision of RSHE. They can see in the daily life in the school how important it is. They have to address inappropriate sexual behaviour very, very regularly, dealing with things like toileting and learning that boundaries about closing the toilet door. These are things we may take for granted, but actually they need to be taught, and they had to be taught early and repeated and repeated and repeated. So the timeliness and the repetition is very important. We can actually learn a lot by looking at how special schools are handling this. So we need to give it even more priority than it's had in the past.
Thank you. And does the current RSE curriculum do enough to tackle misogyny and violence against women and girls? And you just mentioned pornography in the last answer, so...
Sure. The potential is in there by following the guidance to address violence against women and girls. However, there's a cluster of issues in secondary RSE, RSHE, that seem to be repeatedly neglected from what we've heard from surveying large numbers of young people, and we're finding that things like learning about the attitudes of boys and men towards women and girls are often not tackled. Power imbalances in relationships often not tackled. it comes back to that this isn't something you can just reel off some facts about. It relies on the confidence of the teacher to open up discussion to a diverse group and to manage some of those complexities, to have boundaries in place and to progress those conversations, and not to put a sort of a video on and think that's going to do the job, which unfortunately is what young people are complaining about, is that sometimes that's what the lessons are. They're not treating them with the maturity to participate in those discussions, to reflect on their views and know that they may change their minds as well. And, you know, the government's strategy on violence against women and girls is absolutely clear. Inequitable gender beliefs and permissive attitudes about violence against women are important risk factors for male perpetrators. That's in the government's strategy, as is putting education at the forefront of that strategy to prevent violence against women and girls. It's there in the Istanbul Convention, which we're signed up to, that there's a right for children to have education about gender equality, sexuality and healthy relationships. And our statutory guidance gives us that opportunity. We need to, the Sex Education Forum wants to see the government really monitoring their own provision on this and making sure that that right is fulfilled for all children and young people in future.
Yeah, maybe just open that last question up on curriculum to you as well, Jeremy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in relation to how it should be tackling issues of misogyny, issues of violence against women and girls, I think Lucy's absolutely right that the structure is there in the guidance, but there is a huge amount more to be done, particularly on tackling specific issues like the dangers of online pornography, influences, of toxic influences. I mean, we've done a lot of work on these issues over the years. We produced a report a few years ago called Pornography in Human Futures, really unpacking some of the issues of the impact of pornography on young people, but also exploring a far wider set of questions about why this might be the case and what we could do to tackle that. So I think there's a need for further resources on this. It's also a need to recognise that this isn't just something that we tackle in secondary. Like, when we talk about PSHE, like any subject, like you don't start teaching maths with compound interest. You start with basic numeracy. And if we're not putting those building blocks in place in primary, so, thinking about if we're thinking about nude image sharing in secondary, in primary you'd be talking about personal boundaries. You'd be understanding that our behaviour can affect other people, and that if you see something that upsets you, seek help. So you're setting those building blocks in place. Now, I think if we have a programme which certainly the guidance sets out the broad parameters of how we should be doing this, I think, again, Lucy has pointed to, if we listen to children and young people in terms of their experiences of the curriculum, the things they are experiencing in the real world as well. So I suppose by way of example, we supported a piece of research, one of the largest quantitative studies into nude image sharing amongst young people, over 5,000 responses. And one of the things that came out really starkly in this was the gendered nature both of the experiences of girls and boys, but also the expectations. The social norms around image sharing. And in getting that sort of understanding, we were able to develop lesson plans that really responded to that sort of gender dynamic as well. And it's at that level that we need to be engaging with the subject in terms of teaching things about power dynamics, and in terms of ensuring that this is a programme that recognises that whilst these issues, pose huge risks for women and girls, they are also huge restrictions for boys and young men as well. So I think, as I say, the framework is there, but there is more to be done. And again, it comes back to support for teacher training and for schools to feel confident in delivering this material.
Sorry, if you'll indulge me, Chair, you mentioned influencers. How much of a problem are people like Tate?
I mean, I think, if I can answer in terms of how we should be addressing that in schools, clearly many young people are aware.
It's a widespread issue.
It's a widespread issue, unquestionably, and this is clear both from children and young people's reporting and from the media and from probably, if we got the data from TikTok. But I think in terms of how we address this, again, like all things in PSHE, this has to be put in the broad context of understanding the media environment that they're operating in. That's starting from a really early age, that people can lie online, people can present themselves online, thinking about values. I think one of the critical things here, we have the presentation of not only misogynistic values, but kind of get-rich-quick schemes. So that speaks to thinking about understanding, actually financial education, careers and aspirations. So it's not just we need a lesson on toxic influences. Whilst we may need to address, we certainly do need to address those issues, it's got to be in a planned, developmental and sequenced curriculum that is drawing on all of these different aspects. I think one of the previous panelists talked about the role of algorithms and data. In this, we need young people to understand those parts of how content is served to them. Why is it that this person seems so popular? What ways are they gaming the algorithm? In what ways is the content that they're designing trying to appear authentic in that space? So there's lots. It's complicated, but it's all eminently doable. And actually, the guidance sets out a lot of the sort of, in broad terms, the things that children should be taught. So, yeah, it is of course a prevalent problem, but it is one that can be tackled through, in part, in as much as education, it can only ever be part of these solutions. It can be tackled through this.
Super. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. What would you define what is not suitable or appropriate for RSE?
Well, I think, again, it comes back to this question of what is the aim? What are the aims of RSE? We are looking to ensure that young people have an understanding of healthy, safe relationships, that they have an understanding of sex, they have an understanding of, as previous panelists mentioned, the basics of contraception, of STIs, but fundamentally that they have an understanding of sexual ethics and values around this. So this is about teaching about consent, it's about teaching about expectations, it's about teaching about power dynamics. So I think RSE, which there would be a question about RSE, which wasn't coming from a perspective of trying to, have a set of kind of ethical base for what it was thinking about. But I think I would broaden the question about what I would see as problematic to make this more about a pedagogical question, because actually the materials that we see as being potentially problematic in RSHE more broadly are those which aren't adhering to sort of best practice principles of how you tackle these sensitive issues with children and young people. So by way of example, if we're teaching about self-harm, for instance, which can be done safely and effectively, there are ways to do that which could be damaging, in which you might instruct or even inspire practices of self-harm or in the context of eating disorders. Yet there are ways to do this incredibly safely and effectively. So it just comes back to, if teachers are not trained in best practice pedagogy to have these conversations safely, they're not going to be able to choose materials which meet those principles as well.
Do you think it's appropriate to teach children about pornography, sexually transmitted diseases, different types of sexual activity? And if so, from what age is it appropriate to do that?
Of course I think it's appropriate to teach young people about the dangers of online pornography. And I think, again, to come back to this question of age, we need to be putting the building blocks in place. So if we're talking about pornography at Key Stage 1, we need to be teaching young people about rules and restrictions that keep them safe, for example, that sometimes people may behave differently online, and not everything you see online is true. Setting those building blocks so that when we have to start talking about things they may be exposed to, we've got that framework in place. But when it comes down to when should we do this, the critical question, as has been mentioned before, is about developmental appropriateness. There, of course, is a question about age. When do we think young people might encounter these issues? But if we think about developmental appropriateness, one way to think about it is, is this an issue that children might have questions about, and that these are questions that deserve answers right now? Or is it an issue that adults might reasonably think that children need answers to at this point? So to establish that on any issue, we would need to know, prevalence data about the extent to which young people are being exposed, but we also need to know that local data at a school level. PSHE, unlike French, you don't know what young people have learnt before they come into a classroom about the topic. So we need to establish that, and we've loads of ways to do that through baseline assessments, getting a sense of where young people are at.
But what about the content that campaigners are concerned is inappropriate for children to be seeing? Are you aware of this content?
There's a huge range of materials to teach PSHE from a wide range of trusted sources. Now, within that, there are problematic materials which all do exist. But the extent to which they're used in schools, and we have members in over 8,500 schools. We work closely with the school leaders unions, ASCL and NAHT, who represent the vast majority of schools, and we don't recognise a widespread landscape of poor practice.
The negative cases get far more publicity than the good practice that goes on.
I think that is the case, but I think if we want to tackle problematic materials, the place to do it is through teachers. having the training, we have a subject which has only been statutory for 3 years, and because of its lack of statutory status, for years wasn't prioritised. Teachers weren't given the training that they needed. They wasn't given the time. We're in a place where actually the statutory guidance has made a real difference to schools. We need to take advantage of that opportunity to give teachers the training so that if there are problematic materials, and again, I would say this is not simply in the case of RSE, I would want to look at that from best practice pedagogy across the board. They won't get into the classroom because the teachers will know how to choose them.
Thank you, Jonathan. Lucy, same questions. What do you believe is not appropriate to actually be teaching in schools?
There's a process to designing really high quality education, and that needs to be owned by schools. That's our system, that we have schools and we trust teachers. We should trust teachers to design those curriculum. Now, with RSHE being relatively new, there haven't been specialist teachers in the numbers that we need. There hasn't always been space on the timetable or the planning time to do that, or the leadership support for that. With those sort of things in place, then a teacher can lead the subject. They can go through steps thinking about what the learning objectives are going to be. So what is the intention with this learning? What's the goal with this? Planning a curriculum across all the years so you can see a nicely graduated developmental programme with a logical sequence to it that also takes into account tools, respected tools like UNESCO frameworks, child development frameworks like the ones we find from NSPCC. So we're looking at those observations about how children grow up. We're looking about the realities of their lives. We're looking at what those age and stages look like, and the local community. Listening in to what are important issues for parents locally. Are there important faith and cultural perspectives that we need to reflect in this curriculum, this school? What does that look like? What are the live issues? Is it influences this week? The curriculum also needs to be responsive when things crop up. And at this point, the teacher can say, I've designed my learning objectives. What other resources could enhance this learning for my learners? And do I need to adapt them? Will they fit in? Or maybe I'm fine without getting in those additional external resources. Perhaps I can bring in some things to do with puberty, some menstrual products to look at, to discuss, rather than using an external resource. So it is about a process, and that process, us believing that it's worth investing in those teachers' time and training to underpin that. We have to go through those sequences before we can say this in isolation is appropriate.
Are you comfortable with the resource that is available to teachers to actually teach RSE? Are you concerned that any of these resources, or are you with Jonathan and think there's far more good than bad?
I believe that teachers are the main resource. If they are equipped properly to design lessons, they can select from a range of resources and make appropriate decisions about whether that's right in that class at that age or not, and not depend on them as the solution, those external resources as the solution to good relationships and sex education. The evidence says that that isn't the solution. Young people haven't been asking for different resources, they've been asking for teachers to hold these live conversations with them. I'm always interested in what a resource looks like. You know, we want to make sure resources that are there are the best quality they can be, relate to the evidence base, and occasionally we may come across something that doesn't look quite right, and as a sector we need to look at that, interrogate it. But in the vast majority of cases, schools are able to make a selection from the resources available. Unfortunately, though, I'm sorry to say, there hasn't been the investment in teacher training to really say to parents or children and young people, you're going to get a good, well-trained, competent teacher. We're handing this complex task to teachers who don't have the time to develop their own PowerPoints or discussions or scenarios to use with their learners.
The teachers lack the skills.
Some teachers have got it because they've educated themselves over the years. They've found some training to go on. There hasn't been investment in a generation of teachers. Now we have this opportunity. We're a few years into the statutory guidance and implementation. We have an opportunity to do that. Schools need to be trusted with budget, with resource, to know where the gaps are for them and to build that up, and for us to treat it with status like other subjects. It'll take time, but there is a roadmap to that.
What's the barrier to that at the moment?
A mixture of things. Funding for sure, leadership in schools sort of being able to say, well, we've got to carve out the time for this, those are barriers, and I think communications from government to say the starting point to get this right is investing in your staff cohort and having some stability to that cohort so that there aren't different people teaching RSE every year. Also, it would be helpful to see Ofsted commenting when we see really good practice in that trained cohort where there is stability in the teaching and you've got teachers sort of building their career pathway, a sort of professionalisation of the teaching of RSE, which has been lacking to date because we don't see a funnel of people coming through initial teacher training as experts in this subject. Now, we have to look at the whole supply chain for this if we want a generation that will get the quality provision.
I just add one small point to that, just that we know we've been doing quite a lot of work in ITE to support initial teachers coming through, and some higher education providers we've spoken to say that, you know, up to sort of 40% of their young students actually want to specialise in PSHE. The desire is there. We have a generation who are acutely aware of issues around mental health, around relationships, who actually want to go into schools and specialise, but there are real challenges in as much the time in the ITE curriculum as well as the funding issues that schools face, you know, across the board, to actually prioritise the continuing professional development of teachers as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I just want to ask you, and there's a few different aspects of our RSHE that was mentioned there, you know, kind of sex education, pornography, relationships more generally. But one thing that wasn't mentioned was around diversity. So I just wanted to ask you how important you think it is that we teach our young people about the diversity of our communities.
If I can, yeah. So for me, from an academic point of view, based on all the research evidence that's out there, research that I've done myself, and also on past experience and working with very diverse groups such as teenage parents, youth offenders, very, very young people, teenagers. It's vital that we teach them about diversity. It is vital that we teach them about gender and acceptance and LGBTQ plus issues. It is vital we tell them and teach them and work with them to understand. As Jonathan alluded to earlier, this is about human flourishing. This is about acceptance. And this is about realising that we are more the same than we are different in terms of who we are as human beings. So, and some of the work that I've done in terms of masculinity and boys, and a research project that I've got at the moment that builds off the back of another one that I did, links to the points about Andrew Tate and incel culture and manosphere. And that shows us that educating and working with young people in terms of gender is crucial, it's vital. It's something that would be incredibly dangerous to take out of the curriculum.
Thank you. Jonathan, did you want to come in?
I mean, this is about children and young people's real lives, and they are living in our communities, and making sure, so there's one point is around ensuring everyone is represented in the curriculum, that everyone can, you know, that it feels relevant and engaging because they see people like them wherever they are from, whatever religious or cultural background, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability. So there's a big part of just whatever you're teaching, whether it's drugs and alcohol education or careers education, ensuring that our diverse communities are represented throughout, whether that's the scenarios that you're using, the types of issues that you're addressing. So that's absolutely fundamental, as well as specific teaching from a very early age to ensure that we are teaching young people about respect for all and respect, irrespective of difference, and the celebration of that. So I think it's, of course, it's fundamental, but it can't just be seen as a series, you know, a couple of lessons. This is something that has to be threaded through the whole curriculum.
Thanks. Good afternoon, panel. I think, Lucy, you mentioned before about young people and, excuse me 1 minute. Sorry, I'll reframe my question. The first panel talked about how schools procured RSE services, but they painted a picture that it was widely delivered nationally. So I wanted to know from your point of view whether that was something that you were familiar with.
We're not familiar with extreme problems with RSE across the country. The proportionality we're responding to at the moment in discussions about this review don't seem right, don't seem reflective, and it's something that we feel is essential to get this RSHE review right, is to use evidence correctly, to take samples, to hear from teachers, from parents, from young people, and not to just react to sensationalised examples that are very often taken out of context and then become misleading. So while not wanting to comment on particular cases, because often we can't see the context around them, let's go back to proper research, samples of young people, hearing young people's voices about their real experiences in the classroom, teachers' needs and experiences, and a wide range of parents, because when we do, we'll hear the wide-ranging support we have for RSE as well.
Clearly, some schools do procure services externally to deliver RSE. And so, in your opinion, what should the government do to ensure that they're delivering it appropriately, and how should they regulate?
Well, something that we have as a free tool at the Sex Education Forum is a checklist of considerations for a school working with an external provider. So there are things on there about safeguarding and confidentiality policies. There are things about looking at expectations and roles, about making sure that the external provider is adding value to a curriculum sort of designed and managed by the school. Knowing that you should do sort of practical things like have a teacher in the classroom with the external provider. Think about what the school is going to learn and take away from that relationship with an external provider that might sustain their own practice for the long term. Is there a match in values? What is their evidence base? How is the external provider funded? So providing a sort of checklist like that, perhaps the government could do that in the updated RSHE guidance, and then refer schools to it so that they can take that decision-making process on board, and they will need to go through that every time they're working with an external provider, and not sort of just feel that the external provider is a solution to them perhaps sometimes not having the competence in-house to do things. So checklist rather than a register, because that would bring about a different sort of set of complexities, and I can certainly signpost you to our example of a checklist.
Thanks, Lucy. So from your opinion then, the external providers and the content used by external providers that we've met, that was discussed in the first panel, isn't as widespread as you think it is?
Very rarely is it problematic. Schools tell us they are generally very happy with their relationship with external providers, that they value it, that they find there is transparency in the relationship, that the external provider often helps when they are liaising with parents and parents are unsure about how something's being used. Sometimes the external provider holds meetings with parents directly. So it is part of a relationship between all of those stakeholders, and that's how it should be if there's an external provider involved.
Want to come in, John?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I absolutely agree with Lucy about the importance that external providers should be complementing a curriculum if they are used, not replacing it, and that schools need to ensure that they are using a checklist, like Lucy was talking about, to make sure that the external providers are going to provide a robust educational experience for young people. I suppose just to give an example, sometimes those external providers are police officers, for instance. We've done a lot of work with policing on that, and just when we think about what some of the problems are, it's not simply about content, it is also about how things are presented, and we've done a lot of work to try to ensure that police officers, when they're coming in, are bringing their experience and expertise that is relevant, that they actually can bring to a topic, rather than simply coming in to address a topic that ought to be delivered by the teacher. And that has to be done in a way that's bookended with lessons. So a teacher is preparing for that visit, whoever it is, visitor comes in, and there's a follow-up visit to ensure that any issues that have come up can be addressed by the teacher, but also critically that the teacher can assess whether any learning has happened. And that's one of the reasons why it's really important that teachers are in the lessons, that they're integrating it into a curriculum, because this is about education. If you just have a series of external providers coming in, how do you know anything's actually being learned? But that is not to say that they can't be a useful augmentation to a high-quality PSHE curriculum.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to my professional colleagues' perspectives here from an academic point of view, in terms of teachers and in schools, it's not the most comfortable topic for some people to talk about. That's where we're situated within the current social context that we're in, the frameworks that we live within. And so to have external providers come in that are robust, evidence-based, work really well with children and young people and involve the children and young people can be a real supportive infrastructure for teachers and for schools, because young people have told me, and other research projects such as the recent NSPCC project, time and time again, if somebody's uncomfortable teaching RSE, it's awful. You know, it's uncomfortable and nobody gets any benefit from it. So there has to be structures in place, I think, as well, to kind of give permission for teachers to speak to their school leadership team if it is something they feel uncomfortable about, and to work really well with external providers to provide that kind of holistic approach to education.
Thanks, Sophie. And both panels have talked about the importance of parents in RSE, but we know that once children go to secondary school, it's almost like a closed door process for parents, and they don't have the same level of engagement as they would ordinarily have in primary schools. So I just wanted to know, in terms of your opinion about the sharing of RSE materials with parents.
You know, I think, as I said before, transparency with parents is absolutely critical. Of course, parents should be able to see the materials that are being used. I think there is obviously complexity. I mean, we provide parents' versions of our materials that can be shared with parents, but more fundamentally, for many parents, there is a question that goes beyond content. How helpful is it for them to get 40 lesson plans on a Monday morning to go through alone, versus what conversation are we having about what support do they really need to engage in the curriculum, and how can we work together to ensure that what we're doing is helping our children and young people thrive. And it's interesting, you know, in secondary, I know a huge number of secondary schools who are really trying to do a huge amount to engage parents in topics. Certainly when I used to, prior to the association, I was at the National Crime Agency leading education work on child exploitation online, and loads of schools were trying to get parents through the door on issues of online safety, and often struggling. So I think it's you know, it's about, this is actually an opportunity for engaging parents in fundamental issues of their lives. And I know that whilst parents are absolutely the prime educators of their children, they are crying out for support on many of these issues, from online pornography, toxic misogyny, or, you know, aspects of kind of careers in this fast-changing world.
Yeah. And do you think there's enough guidance to help that process between teachers and parents in terms of that process, though, Jonathan?
There is existing guidance, absolutely. So there is guidance from DFE, and NAHT on consultation between primary and between parents and primary schools. There is statements in the statutory guidance already. I think there is almost certainly the need for more support. Again, bearing in mind this came into force over the pandemic as well, which caused some challenges in parental consultation as well. I think anything to remind schools of the importance of how to consult, but also the fact there are loads of different ways that schools are already engaging with parents, and to also use those mechanisms as well.
Thanks, Jonathan. Curveball question: can any of you identify the 72 genders identified in the Cates report? Report, yeah. Email us. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Sorry, just dropped my glasses. Just moving on to the RSHE review. Lucy, you mentioned a couple of recommendations or things that would be helpful. Can you tell me how you think the review should be conducted, please?
So far we haven't heard from young people. We've got to find a robust, accountable process to hear from the beneficiaries of RSHE. So let's find a process for that, and I would like to hear from government what that looks like. That hasn't happened yet. Teachers as well. I understand that the Department for Education has done some evaluation and research with teachers, but that needs to come to the fore in the review process. Ofsted is in the process of doing a report on personal development, a subject report. The findings from that, which will draw on evidence from schools, need to be drawn into the process. Parents' support needs, parents' responses to RSHE, a broad selection of parents' responses need to be heard in this process. But let's not forget that the 2019 guidance was supported by 538 MPs and had broad cross-party support. So we're building on something that's got established support. The research basis hasn't changed, but we need to look at, is it being implemented, and what next? What has changed? Where are the gaps? Let's build on what we've got. The foundations are there. Make sure the right stakeholders around the table. We're using proper evidence, that there is scrutiny around the implementation, that we're not just following misleading reports, and also that the role of the voluntary sector is acknowledged and appreciated. The voluntary sector has often stepped in when there have been gaps in implementation, and that has often been to cover up on training gaps. If training isn't part of the question asked by this RSHE review, we're really facing the wrong way. We need to face inwards and look at why teachers don't feel equipped and empowered at the moment.
Thank you. Can I ask you the same question, Jonathan?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Lucy's put it brilliantly. I would absolutely echo her point about the importance of involving children and young people's voices, the importance of parents, but fundamentally that this is about building on guidance that is only 3 years old, launched during just before the pandemic. So schools have had a lot to deal with in terms of implementation. So it's critical that we look at what the challenges and barriers are to implementing guidance, which, whilst not perfect, sets out a very good framework for what we would want to see in terms of children being taught an education that will help them thrive. I think there's just to add one point to Lucy's, is that when we were making the case for statutory PSHE, I saw it as sort of a baseline. Of course, we should have a subject in schools which is helping young people understand how to stay healthy, to be happy and to thrive. But what does that mean in terms of the rest of the system around children and young people and schools? How are we ensuring link up between, even just for example, signposting in schools? How are we ensuring a link between what's being signposted in a local school and local services? How are we ensuring a link between mental health support teams and what's being taught in RSHE? We know that we hear it from DSLs, the evidence on it is very clear, that often young people will end up reporting concerns that have been raised in PSHE lessons. How are we ensuring the link between the PSHE lead and the DSL, which are two very different roles, but it's critical that there is that overlap? How are we ensuring, even the relationship, I don't believe there's a current link between the RSHE guidance and the DFE's own whole school guidance on promoting mental health. So I think it's, yes, build on the guidance, teacher training, that this isn't, we don't want whole scale, rip it up and start again. We want to, at the most, augment it, look at where challenges for implementation are, but then what does this look like in relation to all of the other systems in children and young people's lives? Because as the Chief Medical Officer said, PSHE is the bridge between public health and the curriculum, and it is what enables us to use the best of public health to sort of, make manifest messages that young people should receive in school. So I'd like to see that, for the future.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Sophie?
Yes, so just obviously completely agreeing with Lucy and Jonathan in how the review should be conducted. It's been something that's really been playing on my mind, actually, that I think it's really important for the committee to consider, is how this is carried out, and to make sure, in addition to what Jonathan and Lucy said, and I think they both alluded to it, that there's got to be robust evidence, and it can come from a range of different lenses to make sure that it negates any ideological and subjective positions. So you might want social scientists, your educationalists, your social policy, your health, your criminologists, psychologists, sociologists, medics, clinical practice, mathematicians. Let's get all of these different lenses on it, in addition to what Jonathan and Lucy said, and of course young people, to ensure that any ideological position is negated, and also that this is going to be for the best for children and young people.
So, what steps do you think the government would need to take to convince people that this is impartial and that it is, and for them to accept the outcomes? Sophie, if I can start.
A range of stakeholders being involved within the review, so academics, professional services, people who work in CSA, sibling sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, children and young people's voices at the forefront, parents, carers, to give all of these different lenses to make it robust, and then it would have to have a very firm, robust methodology, which I haven't seen in recent reports.
I think young people's voices are often forgotten. Did you have anything to add, Jonathan or Lucy? No? Okay,
I think may I just briefly say, I think it would be helpful if the government confidently signposted that conclusive evidence that we have about the impact of RSE on behaviour change, which is not disputed and underpinned the 2019 guidance. There has to be confidence in that evidence base that has already been scrutinised by Parliament. Otherwise, we're sort of questioning the wrong things, I think.
Thank you. And I asked the previous panel this, and I'll ask you the same question. Is there a risk that in reviewing the teaching of RSE and gender issues in particular, that we risk repeating the failings of Section 28?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I read the Cates dossier, there were some really firm echoes of Section 28 in there. Personally, as a 43-year-old, reading through that, it was there, and you could see the thread. For me, personally, looking at it in an academic sense, and I think we've got to be very careful of how the review is conducted. If the committee can take anything from this, it's how the review is conducted from all of those different robust lenses with robust evidence. It's got to be robust, it's got to be valid, it's got to be trustworthy, and it's got to be reliable.
Thank you. Do you want to...
I mean, I think this is such a critical subject for children and young people's lives and for society in general that we do risk undermining teachers' confidence and sense of safety in delivering this subject. The more that they are challenged by parents, the less they are supported by government on areas where at the same time they are being left without the right levels of training and a lack of confidence anyway, then it risks schools actually having that sort of chilling effect on schools. So I think it's critical that the review is hugely supportive of the consensus around this subject, of the progress that has been made so far, looks at the evidence around how teachers are implementing and how that is going, and builds on the steps we've taken so far and doesn't take any steps backwards.
Yeah, I think if we're not careful, there's a risk that it could be too prescriptive moving forward and not give the freedom that I think teachers need in carrying out their jobs. Carolyn?
Yeah, last question from me. There's a tightrope here, isn't there? You've been going for 3 years. This has been going for 3 years, and it's going to be reviewed. The campaigners would say that it's not working at all. We need to protect children. The government has a responsibility, and parents too have the right to have a say. What would you be doing now to actually change this environment, to get everybody on board so that everybody was singing from the same hymn sheet?
I think it's about the environment of the debate. How do we have a constructive debate if we're shouting at each other across the halls? And I think to do that, again, as Dr. King-Hill said, and as Lucy said, we have rafts of evidence from many different disciplines of the impact that high-quality RSHE can have, yes, on relationships and understanding and safeguarding, on physical and mental health, on academic attainment, starting from that point, but also, yes, engaging parents in a conversation. What that looks like in terms of a national conversation, I'm not sure, but we need to ensure we're hearing from a diversity of parents. 92% of parents supported statutory PSHE at the time that we were making the case for it. So where are they, and how are their voices being heard? It is totally understandable that parents will have concerns about a subject which is teaching things which are about children and young people's real lives, situations they're going to be in. I want to know what my child's school is teaching in PSHE. As you can imagine, I'm probably quite annoying about that. But so that's totally understandable. So we have to start from the perspective that everyone, has everyone has a right to have a voice here, to be heard, and to have constructive dialogue. But that dialogue has to be constructive. It has to start from a perspective that looks at what's actually happening in schools and looks at that in the broadest of contexts as well. Not simply, if we're looking at teacher training, we need to look at that in the context of the initial teacher education as a whole. There are reasons why it is very hard to incorporate enough within IT. There are reasons why schools aren't able to access continuing professional development, but we need to do that in a way that isn't undermining all of the good practice and actually the experience and expertise that exists in the sector. You know, we've been teaching drugs and alcohol education in schools since the 80s. There's a wealth of experience in, you know, as that kind of one of the foundational aspects of the subject. So we're not starting from nothing here, and I believe there is a significant consensus here. We need to ensure that we can have those kind of constructive conversations. Basically, as you saw, huge amount of commonality in aims and objectives between the three of us here and the previous panel around talking about many of the same issues. So there's a lot of shared goals here. We just need to be able to have constructive discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nice positive note to end our evidence session on. Can I thank you all for coming along today? It's extremely helpful. Order.